Yes, as you mentioned, Fiona, I did present to the local Tauranga Rotary a couple of weeks ago, and it was requested after that to present to Bay of Plenty Regional Council. So look, I'll just share my screen if you can bear with me. Okay, so can everyone see the presentation? Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Well, look, what I provided to the Tauranga Rotary, which is exactly this presentation, is very much just an overview, and some of you will have seen parts of it before, but we do update it every year after we finish, obviously, our financial year, and then just obviously everything that we are going to provide, and I will share today, is publicly available in the public domain. So clearly just a disclaimer there, we're not providing a selective briefing here in any way, shape or form. And so I will get into the presentation. So I'm more than happy to take questions either throughout or at the end of it, and happy to have a conversation. So first of all, obviously, you'll be familiar with Port of Tauranga, the parent company being the port here in Tauranga, and investments in terms of port investments in terms of both 50% shareholding in Northport, 50% shareholding in Prime Port Timaru. We have a terminal concession to operate the container terminal in Timaru. We have inland ports in Auckland, Christchurch, and the newest inland port in Ruakura. And we also have some subsidiary businesses, associate businesses, Coda and Port Connect, which is the Fonterra Landside Logistics, and an IT type business with Port of Auckland, and a subsidiary business being Quality Marshalling, which operates the container terminal in Timaru and the Ruakura Inland Port, as well as provides services here in Tauranga. A little bit about the port, and again, this will be familiar to yourselves, and this is updated as of 30 June 2024. So in terms of total tonnes or total volume, we represent 32% of New Zealand's total trade, and 38% of New Zealand's exports by tonnage. So that's by tonnes, and this is statistics data, to the 30 June. By value, and again, statistics data, we also represent 32% of New Zealand's total trade by dollar value as well. And that's broken down by 47% of New Zealand's exports by value and 17% of New Zealand's imports by value. If we take that a step further and we convert it a little bit into containerization, and so when we look at container market share is just a sum of our share of those containers. Now, I do want to point out we do 1.2 million containers per annum, and what we have here is 832. What it does is excludes transshipment. The difference between the two is transshipment. So this is just direct import and export. We are by far the largest transshipment port as well. But by container numbers, we represent 39% of New Zealand's total container trade, and 44% of New Zealand's exports by container trade. Just touch quickly on some of the health and safety for the year. So again, one of the challenges around any type of operation like ours is obviously the people factor, and obviously one of the most important things of our business is keeping our people safe. We have had a really good year in terms of continuous improvement around health and safety, in terms of the leading indicators, in terms of observations and near hit reporting, but also lag indicators being total recordable injury frequency rate and lost time injury frequency rate, both significant improvement in terms of those figures over the year. So what I would say from a health and safety perspective is that we're not satisfied. We will continue to obviously work towards this, and there is a continuous improvement mindset when we talk about health and safety. Just touch quickly on productivity, and again, really pleasing for the year that our productivity was up 8% for the year from the previous year. Obviously, during the COVID period, dealing with congestion and significant challenges around vessel vessels not arriving on their scheduled arrival window, it has been challenging maintaining productivity, but we have made some significant improvements. We're just over 30 moves an hour for our net crane rate, which is moves per hour, versus the national average at 25, and the Australian national average is just below 24 moves an hour. So we're the most productive port in Australasia in terms of container productivity. Just touch on the consent update, and obviously this has subsequently been surpassed. So we have been obviously going through the Environment Court process. We have, at the end of 30 September, we did provide our last feedback to our feedback to the Environment Court. I can't say if it was our last feedback because we've requested the court make a decision. At this point in time, we're awaiting decision. As I mentioned here, we have also applied to be included in the fast track legislation, and as was announced on Sunday, really pleased to be included in that draft legislation, and that's looking to be enacted by the end of the year. So the challenge for us really is that we are out of capacity. We have capacity shortages at the container terminal at the moment, and it's capacity not from a yard or terminal perspective, it's capacity from a berth perspective. So we need the ability to be able to berth more vessels, more frequent vessels on the container terminal at a new berth. So that is the challenge we face at the moment. And so we have been in a situation, certainly over the past 12 months, where we've had to turn away services that were new services going to Call New Zealand. In terms of why it's important, I guess, and this is where we go back to, we haven't got the latest data for the year, our financial year 2024, but for 2023, at 2.3 million tonnes of dairy exports per annum, that represents 70% of New Zealand's total dairy export trade. At 550,000 tonnes of red meat exports, that represents 61% of New Zealand's red meat exports. We do around 30% of New Zealand's logs at 6.7 million tonnes, and 85% of obviously New Zealand's kiwi fruit, given the proximity of the kiwi fruit crops to the port. So I guess the real challenge is that it's an issue in terms of capacity for Port of Tauranga, but it's a bigger issue in terms of our exporters and importers as we look to continue to grow over the years. Touch quickly on our terminal automation project. So we are continuing to progress down the path of terminal automation. I just want to make it clear here that our terminal automation that we're looking to deploy is not new technology. There's a lot of concerns raised around automation given the challenges that Auckland experienced, but for us, what we're looking to deploy are auto stacking cranes. The level of complexity is a lot lower given that they are fixed on rails and they run backwards and forwards. That's all they do, as opposed to autonomous straddles that can go anywhere. It's also been technology that's been used around ports in the world now for over 20 years. So it's proven technology as opposed to something that was at the time world first with what Auckland were proposing to do. What I would say here, the challenge around this is that we cannot deploy the auto stacking cranes until we have a berth. Where we're looking to deploy them is right behind the new berth, and so the timing in terms of this development is going to be subject to having the berth there to be able to facilitate it. Again, I'll just move into now, I guess, some of the looking at some of the constraints, and I guess and looking at a bit of the strategy and the outlook moving forward. When we look at the Upper North Island supply chain in particular, if we do a comparison between Auckland and Tauranga, clearly we see a lot of constraints in terms of land constraints in Auckland, continuing population growth, but also lack of industrial land and availability, and cost of that land in Auckland is continuing to drive business and manufacturing and import supply chains further south and north. If we look at the available asset here in Tauranga in terms of the land holding of the port, we're very fortunate to have 190 hectares of land versus the 80 hectares in Auckland itself in terms of the entire Ferguson, Bledisloe and General Wharves terminal. If we go a little bit closer and we look at the container terminal, given the announcement that there will be a container terminal in Auckland for at least the next 35 years, which we support, and you actually just look at the physical characteristics of the Auckland terminal versus the Tauranga terminal, just the footprint area in Auckland, anyway you look at it, it's an 18-hectare terminal. It's got a western berth and a northern berth, which is always challenging in the corners. You always have a challenge in the corner areas around loss of productivity because you have the overhang of cranes, versus Port of Tauranga, which is a 57-hectare container terminal, and will have a berth of up to just under 1.2 kilometres. It's a long lineal quay, which is much better from an operational perspective in terms of not having that loss of operational area. And what we are very fortunate is to go and have excellent road and rail connections here in Tauranga, with 3 800-metre sidings, rail sidings here in the Port of Tauranga at Sulphur Point, as well as state highway connections into the port in terms of a grade separated interchange. From a productivity perspective, you can see from the stats there, the average vessel exchange at 1,500 moves, Port of Auckland, based on their crane rates of 23 moves an hour, and this data here versus Port of Tauranga at 31.2. That's a 37-hour exchange to undertake that container call in Auckland versus a 25-hour exchange. And so that 12 hours in the context of shipping, but also in the context of terminal capacity, is significant in terms of the ability to continue to grow. And we do offer, as I mentioned before, very good productivity through Tauranga. I'll touch on quickly, because there's a lot of talk around supply chains and lower carbon supply chains, and in particular emissions. And Auckland rightly point out that for an importer importing into the Auckland market, they do offer the lowest carbon supply chain if you only take into account the road delivery from the port to the importer in the Auckland market. But if you just go and take the carbon calculator from Auckland and you take it into account of the overall journey, which takes into account the deep sea, the landside emissions, i.e. the road delivery in Auckland, only accounts for 1.6% of the total emissions. And so where this becomes relevant is when our importers and exporters are having to take account, having regard to and pay for their emissions. By far the biggest proportion of emissions that are emitted is on the ocean freight leg, and the single biggest option to go and reduce those emissions is having access to larger vessels, where the emissions is nearly 20% lower by a 8,000 TEU vessel versus a 4,000 TEU vessel that's at a per container basis. And so because we at the moment are the only port that's able to offer this size of container vessel, and will continue to do so, we're very well positioned to be able to offer the lowest carbon supply chain. If you then go and look forward and you go and say from a shipping line perspective and what's happening, the shipping lines are only building vessels that are in that larger category range. And so the vessels that we have today calling, which we call big ships at 9,000 TEU, they're all 25 years old. The Panamax ships that we have calling today that were built in the 90s are nearing 30 years old, and they're all the vessels that are sitting in that 4,000 to 6,000 TEU range that are currently calling New Zealand. The reality is as much as we'd like to dictate to the shipping lines or the global shipping lines to build ships just for our trade in New Zealand is just too small for the shipping lines to build ships specifically for our trades. And so the reality is that we will see cascading vessels, as we've seen the current class of vessels cascade out of trades as they've been upsized. We will continue to see that. And so from a port perspective, we will need to be able to cater for the new Panamax class of vessels over time. And that new Panamax class of vessels may not be here in the next 5 years, it may not be the next 10, but it's going to be in that 10 to 15 year range. And so in terms of those vessels, they will be up to a size of 12 to 15,000 TEU, and we will require a draft of 15 to 15.5 metres. Where do we sit at the moment? Our current high water draft is 14.7. We are very fortunate that we hold an existing resource consent for up to 16 metres. So where I say 16-metre high water draft, we hold a existing consent for a low water draft of 14.5 metres. We have a minimum high tide tidal window of 1.5 metres. So that means that on the tide at the moment, we can take anything. We will be able to take a vessel in the future at 16 metres or that 15.5-metre draft. At the moment, we have a low water draft of 13.2, and at the high tide 14.7. And it's interesting if you look at the ports in Australia, and this will be updated over time. All of the ports in Australia, in particular Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, have announced that they will be needing to cater for the new Panamax class of vessels. So it is something that in the future port studies, in particular around infrastructure in Australia, they are focusing on the new Panamax class of vessels, which is the size I referred to previously. In terms of the port, we've had a decade of significant growth, but that growth has been a decade of export-led growth. In terms of, and I say pre-COVID period, so prior to 2020, for the period 2009 to 2019, we had a 100% increase in total tonnage. In terms of containers, we had a 126% increase in total containers. Since the COVID period, and this is not just true of Port of Tauranga, this is true of the entire port sector and freight market, it has been relatively flat and relatively stagnant. It's been a lot harder to do business, and productivity has been a lot more difficult, but total volumes have hardly increased at all. In fact, for Tauranga, we're actually down from where we were back in 2019. And as I mentioned, that growth has been driven largely by exports through Tauranga. If we look at the export sector, however, moving forward, and you take into account the MPI forecasts in terms of some of our key commodities over the next 5 years, it's not a particularly rosy picture. In particular, if you look at dairy, the forecast for dairy for the next 5 years is expected to be quite flat. There may be some commodity mix change between the likes of UHT and powders, but it is relatively flat in terms of total volumes. The red meat sector is expected to decline over 8% over the next 5 years, and I think we see that in terms of some of the processing overcapacity in the South Island at the moment, and some of the unfortunate closures of those facilities. I guess the challenge here, and what doesn't quite reconcile from our perspective, is that there's a stated objective from the government to double the value of export earnings over the next decade. It seems quite difficult that when 85% of those export earnings come from the agri sector, and dairy, red meat make it such a significant proportion of that, it seems difficult to go and see how you're going to double the export value without an increase in some increase in volume. So it is something that we're certainly hopeful we may see the trend reverse. On the flip side, from a forestry and fibre perspective, total exports out of New Zealand expected to increase 13%, or available exports 13% over the next 5 years. From a Port of Tauranga perspective, however, the Central North Island's pretty flat in terms of total log volume, total available volume. We did 6.7 million tonnes last year. The available export harvest for us is somewhere between that 6 and 6.5 million tonnes, based on the forecasts our customers are giving us. Kiwi fruit, we had a really strong bounce back in terms of kiwi fruit this year. Volumes will be above those that were forecasted by MPI for the 2024 year. And look, I guess there is some still significant growth there for kiwi fruit. If we go and look at that and say, well, look, we've got the challenges around some of our export trades, but what is growing? Well, in particular for us in the Upper North Island, we've got significant growth forecast in terms of population. And there's been various studies you look at, and we've looked at about 4 different studies, but we've adopted the one that was used by the Bay of Plenty Regional Council in terms of forecasting population growth. And again, if you look at it, over the next 2 decades, significant growth in the Upper North Island, in particular Auckland, with overflow into both Hamilton and Tauranga, and ultimately Auckland over the next 2 decades with another 500,000 to 700,000 people. And that's going to be from port perspective, what that means is that we've had a really strong period of export growth, but our strategy will need to pivot and change somewhat to be a bit more focused around imports as we look to support that growth in the Upper North Island. And so this is a slide that you may remember we've been talking about for a few years now, but it's very consistent. This is how we see a resilient Upper North Island supply chain. This is what we see will help facilitate that population growth in terms of building the port infrastructure to support it. But it's also something that we talk very openly with Ministry of Transport and government around the needing to facilitate the infrastructure, whether it be roads or rail, to help support it as well. And so from a port perspective, when we look at here in Tauranga, we have the Port of Tauranga terminal development, obviously a key component of it in terms of growing capacity through the container terminal for an increase in vessels, but also volume. If we look at Northport, we have the Northport vision for growth. And again, key to unlocking this is obviously consenting around future berths. There is an existing consent that's already held for one berth, but future berths to facilitate growth, but also connection to the rail corridor over time. It is pleasing, and there is a discussion in terms of, well, obviously the government's currently announced roading, 4-laning of highways through to Whangarei, and from our perspective, it's not an either or, it's an and. And the question around Northport is just a question of timing. This may be 10 years or 15 years, but the reality is that if you think back at some of the footprint constraints or the land constraints in Auckland and the terminal constraints, we will need Tauranga and we will need to develop Northport to help facilitate that growth in the Upper North Island. And then obviously from a Waikato perspective or the Golden Triangle, we see significant growth opportunities, in particular around imports into the Ruakura precinct. You can see in the top left there, I think Kmart, New Zealand's second largest import, is already a really good example of that import. National distribution centre was previously located in Auckland. That was moved to Ruakura because, again, cost of land, access to labour, and the ability to then have access to both Port of Tauranga and Auckland, as well as good road and rail connections. If we look further forward and we look at the, in a future state when we have undertaken the investments in the future, it is very logical that over time, and this again may be 15, 20 years out, it is very logical that you'd expect to see a container terminal on both sides of the harbour. And that's important because when we look to go and build berths on the Mount Maunganui wharves, they're a 50 to 70 year investment. It is important that when we build those berths that we do contemplate the need for containers on both sides of the harbour, and in particular when you build the infrastructure, having the ability to cater for gantry cranes or putting crane rails in the berth when they're built. In terms of Metroports, so just touch quickly on the Metroport volume. We've had some significant increases in the cost of rail over the past 5 years. In particular, we've been a bit vocal in terms of, we've had an 82% increase in the cost of rail. That's been very difficult to pass on. What it's meant is as we've looked to pass those on, the demand has increased, and it is something we're working closely with KiwiRail. We're currently running 54 trains a week down from the 92, but the reality is that with the capacity constraints in Auckland, we're going to need to continue to grow our volume on rail and continue to grow it through both Auckland and Northport and into Ruakura. I've mentioned this before. We are the largest origin destination on the entire rail network. We handle just over 40% of all of the freight tons on the rail network. And the point I make here is that it uses less than 10% of the entire network in terms of distance. So you've got 10% of the network handling just under half of the total rail freight volume. So I guess from our perspective, the real challenge is getting the right investment into our network and also then the right cost to go and support that, given that it appears that, based on the current track user charging mechanism, we will be subsidising other parts of the network. Transshipment, significant part of our strategy, in particular, as you see the introduction of larger ships. I'll point out the difference between 2016 and 17. The only difference there is the introduction of the AC3 or the large ships, so the 9,000 TEU ships. So the moment a large ship calls and it cannot get to every port because it simply cannot fit in other ports, and it calls at Tauranga, then what happens is we start transshipping from smaller ships onto that larger ship through Tauranga. And that's a trend that in particular, as the ships continue to grow larger, and also from an environmental perspective, coastal shipping offers a very low emissions supply chain to go and connect into those larger ships. Vehicle movements, conversely, so significant growth in road and rail over the past period of time, but since 2018, we've actually had a reduction in total truck movements on and off the port. But that being said, we very much supportive of the critical road infrastructure that we need here in Tauranga, in particular Hewletts Road, Totara Street interchange, and obviously State Highway 29 and Takatimu Drive North. Start moving into some of the ESG metrics. So really pleasing for the year that we have dropped total emissions for the year to 34,000 tonnes, down 21% since 2018. And in terms of emissions intensity or CO2 per tonne of cargo, a 9.1% decrease from the previous year. Our single biggest opportunity to continue to reduce our emissions will be to look to introduce automation. ASCs are electric, they're fully electric as opposed to diesel straddles, and they will replace one ASC block replaces 9 straddles, so significant opportunity to decarbonise. Touch on some of the local initiatives. Obviously, we've continued to work closely together around trying to improve air quality. Our approach to air quality is a continuous improvement approach. It's never going to be good enough. We'll always need to do more, and we are continuing to look to do that over the year. Again, we're installing significant amounts of wind fencing. There's new wind fencing being erected at the moment. We've introduced water misting on hoppers as well as alarms and a number of boundary plantings. From a water quality perspective, we're really pleased that while we are compliant with all of the consents that we hold around stormwater discharge, and including the new consents that we obtained in 2019, we are actually going above and beyond. The board approved in May our first above ground stormwater treatment. We will deploy the first of the stormwater treatment on the Mount Maunganui wharves. The wharves were built in the 1950s, and unlike Sulphur Point that was built in the 90s, they don't have catchment ponds. There is no catchment ponds to contain and then to, if necessary, treat the stormwater before it discharges into the harbour. And so the stormwater, not just from the port, but from the entire Mount Maunganui industrial area, does go out through the port there into the harbour. What we will do now is we will have the ability to capture that. It will go into an above-ground lamella unit where we can go and take any particulates out of it and treat it if necessary and put it back into the harbour to improve the stormwater. So that was something that we're very pleased our board approved. Sorry.
Leonard, you'll be treating stormwater from the broader industrial zone, just not the port. Is that correct?
Correct. Our pipes connecting to the TCC stormwater network, and so we'll pick up all of it. We don't, unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of just taking ours.
Do you get a contribution from the others for that investment?
No, we haven't requested one. I guess it's the right thing to do, and that's the approach we've taken.
Well, while you're on there, Leonard, Taru here, that 13% reduction in carbon emissions, you're currently getting, where's that coming from? What's contributing to that?
So there's a number of factors. We've gone and purchased new hybrid straddles, which are roughly 20% fewer, 20% more fuel efficient, and as a result, lower emissions. And also because we take on the emissions of the rail trains that we run, with the reduction in the number of trains that we're running on Metroport, that has contributed to the reduced emissions for the year.
So when you bring in the automated straddles or cranes, what do you anticipate that reduction will rise to?
So we've modelled it, and there's up to, I want to be careful that we're not banking these things, but in the modelling that we've undertaken, there's a 75% reduction in emissions.
Wow.
It's our
Okay.
single biggest. It's our single biggest source of emissions is actually from diesel straddles, and our single biggest opportunity for the port is actually to move to electric ASCs.
Oh, great. Thank you.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
And just finally, this is the last slide. Just we recognise that we are a really important part of the community, and in particular, a number of organisations that we support, and we're really proud to continue to support. Obviously, the most recent being the Mount Maunganui Surf Lifeguard. So that brings us to the end. I will stop sharing there, and then happy to take any questions.
The development of the Ringiuru Industrial Park, any sense of impacts of that in the context of the port at all?
Look, I think as we continue to grow, I mean, from my perspective, there's a lot of synergies there with a growing kiwi fruit sector. There's a lot of synergies with the potential post-harvest, and also the need for packing containers and things like that to get them through to the port. So there seems to be opportunities there for growth. And then I just think from a port perspective, we certainly see we have a lot of interest from shipping lines looking for alternative locations for empty containers, which we're very supportive of.
Okay, thank you, mate.
Leonard, can I ask, given the problems you've been having with the Environment Court and getting your consents for the berthage extension, I've been reading that, at the point we're actually turning ships away. What has anyone done, yourselves as a port company and the importers exporters, a cost analysis of what it's costing the New Zealand economy?
Yeah, we commissioned a NZIER report. I don't have the figures keen off the top of my head, but I'm happy to kind of to look at sharing them. We commissioned it in terms of the cost to New Zealand GDP, if you like, and the cost to the regional economy and things like that. But it's not an accurate reflection of the cost to New Zealand's shippers, importers and exporters. And the reason I say that is that I'll give you the example that the one that I was referring to with the vessel we turned away. So that I can't go into too many details because obviously some of it was confidential. But what I can say is it was a new service that was going to go to the west coast of the United States. It was going to the west coast of the United States because of the constraints in the Panama Canal. It was going to go, and there was extremely high demand. And as a result of that, there was a lack of capacity. That lack of capacity meant that the freight rates that New Zealand's exporters were paying increased by about 70% in the space of 6 months. What the shipping line was going to do was bring on a new service because, frankly, they saw an opportunity to make money. But what they would have done is introduce new capacity, and the laws of supply and demand would have come into effect. And that 60% increase in freight rates would have been reduced to an extent because there would have been new capacity. And that's the real cost. I mean, that's the real benefit of capacity, is that actually New Zealand's exporters in this case wouldn't have had to have paid that level of high freight rate. And that's not. And the challenge with that, and that's why I say the NZIER report, it's very difficult to calculate that given it's quite fluid and you're subject to international freight rates.
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, kia ora, I have a couple of questions. Thanks, Leonard. That was awesome. So my first question is around just with the trains. I just couldn't quite follow exactly what you're saying. So what percentage currently of your export products come to the port by train?
So for the container terminal, and I'll just so we do 1.2 million TEU or containers, 20-foot equivalent units. 60% of that moves on or off by rail. It's not just exports; it's imports as well, because all of our imports.
Yeah.
And then a third of our containers that come in and out of the port never touch the road because they come in from a smaller ship They get unloaded from a smaller ship, put into the terminal, and then loaded onto a big ship. So a third of our volume is transshipment. So a relatively small percentage of our container volume moves on road.
Okay. And do you think that over time, more and more could come off freight road and be more freight rail? Or do you see that as a static sort of proportion?
Oh, look, we are by a long way, we're the highest volume by any port in terms of the volume moving on and off by rail. But I think the dynamics, and I'd be interested, I mean, Ken will have a view on this, given your background, Ken. The dynamics around rail pricing and the competitiveness of rail will be largely driven by a central government approach to road pricing. And so I see, you know, talking to Minister of Transport and others, there seems to be a very strong desire to move the cost of the alternative, i.e. road, up, which will inevitably lead to more volume on rail. From an infrastructure and capacity perspective, we have significant headroom to be able to take more rail volume in and out of the container terminal. The bulk is a little bit more difficult because of where it's going to. So, for example, you know, the importation of stock feed, for example, that's going to be delivered into a farm or to a warehouse, the ability for rail access is just a lot more difficult. Similarly, with some of the forests, where they're not located near a railhead, you'll harvest a forest. It's very difficult to go and put it onto rail before it will come into the port.
Yeah, okay. And maintenance, I suppose maintenance of rail or investment in maintenance of rail, absolutely crucial for that to not be underfunded in terms of this.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the, I guess the point, you know, we make to Kiwi Rail and to ministers regularly is that, you know, you've got just under half of the entire rail freight volume moving on our particular part of the corridor. There's a 4,000 kilometre rail network, and across that 4,000 kilometre rail network, you've got just under 50% of it moving on our part coming to and from Port of Tauranga. The average distance that it moves is 240 kilometres. So double round trip it, because it's you've got to go back, so call it 480. But the reality is you got 10% of the network with 50% of the freight, or just under, yet the investment in the rail has had $8 billion over the last 6 years, has not been, you know, if you use that that analogy, that should have mean we should have had $4 billion invested in our part of the network, and we just simply haven't had it.
Yeah. Thank you. I just had one more quick question, if I may. And that was about, you know, you put your last slide on with all the social license, you know, supporting non-profit organisations and community groups, etc. Iwi Hapu. I just wondered about environmental offsetting. So whether you plan to do more of that, and you know, things like seabird habitat restoration, environmental restoration of Tauranga Moana. What's your plans in terms of investment in your environmental license for sort of doing some really cool stuff in that space?
Yeah, look, we're absolutely invested in any opportunities to look at that, but not just. I mean, we do a lot as a result of consent. So obviously we have the established from the dredging consent that we have that we obtained in 2011. We established the Ngāmatarai Trust. The Ngāmatarai Trust is a trust where there's the 5 representatives across Tauranga Moana from a iwi and hapu perspective, as well as the Maoao Trust and a number of others, and then there's the port. And it's actually been really pleasing to see that, you know, we've got over $1 million that we've actually spent in initiatives to go and improve lots of different things, like, for example, the Kopere Rua, we've invested in terms of the wetland restoration, cleaning up, all of those type of initiatives. What I would say is that we would do that with or without consents regardless. And so whilst we're going through this process, we're proposing a lot more investment into other initiatives, but we're actually open to any initiative. So we also do the Great Beach Cleanup. Once a year we've supported the our backyard trust in terms of clearing up the harbour and going out. We put all of our equipment into it to go and pick up. We took out all of the cars that were in the submerged cars in the Omokoroa Channel. All of those type of things we would support because it's the right thing to do.
Well, thank you.
Leonard, Andrew von Dadelson, thank you for another really good presentation. I just want to talk about the Kaimai Tunnel and risks and opportunities for you. Do you have a feel for that as to is there potential risk there for you, and is there opportunity for expansion?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. There's no question that it's with a 9 kilometre single track rail tunnel. It is a risk. It is a risk in terms of if there was to be a natural disaster or something of that nature, that is a significant risk. From a capacity perspective, it's not as much of a risk. We've been very fortunate to work alongside KiwiRail for a long time in terms of the investment around passing loops. So there is significant capacity in the passing loops that have been put into the East Coast Main Trunk over the last decade. Not so much in the last couple of years, but certainly over the last prior to that, they were there. And also what Ruakura does is offer us a significant opportunity to boost capacity on the rail network with the rail infrastructure that we've put in there. So it is a point of potential risk around resilience, in particular, given it's a single tunnel, single line tunnel, and it's 9 kilometres long. We've been involved and approached by multiple parties over the years around a future state where you might see a new road rail tunnel through the Kaimais. That to us, again, we've never seen the cost benefit analysis of it, but that's something that you would have thought over time would be quite a logical, major project from a New Zealand Inc. perspective.
Thank you.
Just a question about export volumes and values, really. You mentioned about how the government wants to double exports, but they're also talking about doubling them in terms of value as opposed to volume.
Correct.
Is that realistic, number one? And if so, does that give you a bit of breathing space?
That's the narrative. And I had some good discussions with Minister Todd McClay around this because the aspiration is to double them in terms of value. I guess I find that a little bit challenging, not unrealistic, but challenging in terms of when you're subject to global commodity prices, when you're effectively a price taker, not a price setter when it comes to some of the global commodity markets around, whether it be around export logs, whether it be dairy, or in fact, whether it be red meat. So to have an aspiration to double the value when you're a price taker seems to be a challenge. I can see the doubling of the value if you were also going to increase the volume. But you're going to me, it just seems that it might be aspirational as opposed to something that you could go and count on.
Leonard, Jane Nees here. Good to see you. We've had a few incidences with ships in the channel, sort of failure of power. What sort of business continuity planning do you have in place? Yeah,
it's a really good question, Jane, and it is something that we spend a lot of time talking to Maritime New Zealand about, and obviously as well as with your harbour master as well. So look, we've been through quite an extensive process. We've increased the tug escort procedures, so we escort more, or actually all vessels, and in particular ones that are longer and higher class. The next step for us, and this is something that is not yet approved by the board, and is something we'll be putting through to the board, is we will need to have replace a tug. The Sir Robert that we have here is now coming up 40 years old. It does need to be replaced. When we replace the Sir Robert, the proposal will be that we'll provide it will be a bigger tug, which will have the ability to have greater holding powers and potential, not salvage, but rescue powers for some of those vessels that potentially have a main engine failure, and we need to help. Our new tugs that we have at the moment are actually perfect. They're great tugs, the Taitemu and the Taipari that were brought in 2015. The challenge is that they're harbour tugs, and so once you go out of the entrance, and if a tug is needed outside, they have less capability. And so what we're looking for is a hybrid tug that will have greater ability to go and handle vessels that potentially outside of the entrance.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Leonard. I think you've exhausted my councillors, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to ask you questions. Are there any final questions? Councillor Winters.
Yeah, hi Leonard, Kevin Winters here. Last time I met you, I asked the question about what keeps you awake at night, and you said health and safety, and I understand that. So what would be number 2 and 3 on your list if health and safety is still the number 1 on your list?
Look, health and safety will always be, given the nature of it and our people, will always be number 1. Number 2 for me really is around, providing the infrastructure and capacity that this business needs. That is kind of, for me, it's important that that where this business has been a great business that's been really well positioned for people that have come long before me, and I want to make sure that that I put this business in a position that it's in a better place for the next people to come through.
Yeah. And number 3?
Look, in number 3, I guess it's New Zealand, it's trading conditions, it's it's all of the challenges I'd have around those things in terms of the outlook. There's the impacts of geopolitical instability on trade in New Zealand. It's our competitiveness of our exporters and on the global stage. It's all of those things that kind of spend a bit of time. I have to say I don't spend a lot of time, Kevin, ranking them. I'm pretty much comfortable around number 1, around understanding health and safety in our people. There's always the constant kind of the phone's on all the time, so there's always a consideration around an event, whether it be as Jane mentioned before, a vessel foundering and things like that. That's we have a strategic risk register. That's one of the things that's always on there. But yeah, look, I guess outside of that, it's kind of setting this business up for the long term.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Leonard. Thank you for all the information that you've provided. As Councillor Von Dadelson said, it's a very, very good presentation, and we really do appreciate your time. Are there any final questions from councillors? If not, just thank you so much for your time, Leonard, and we will make this available to the other councillors who weren't available this afternoon.
No problem at all. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leonard.